was America's second battle for independence.
I think the War of 1812 is a lot more important than we have given it credit for.
It renewed patriotism and pride and ushered a young country into a new age of prosperity.
Our world powerness, if you will, was pretty much guaranteed as a result of the War of 1812.
People who passionately believed that their cause was right, and there they were, fighting to the death for that cause.
200 years later, New York State and Canada commemorate the veterans and battlefields of the War of 1812. The depth of the Great Lakes and their windswept shores hold the memories of that war, waged between a young American republic, growing Canadian territories, and a bruised British Empire. But with each passing year, there is less physical evidence of this significant part of our history. Populations grow, development expands, preservationists rise to the challenge.
Most battlefield sites are quite big, and even today only fragments of them survive.
Most people in New York don't realize nor appreciate the history that they've got.
And it's unique, because nobody else has got that piece from American history. So preserve the doggone thing.
The lands where men fought and died for their country are in danger of disappearing forever. Join us as we walk the paths of history in northern New York to discover how sustainability, interpretation, and creative heritage economics may be the key to prevent all of us from losing ground.
Losing ground, the race to preserve War of 1812 battlefields in New York State is made possible through the support of our members.
And by the National Park Service's American Battlefield Protection Program, promoting the preservation of significant historic battlefields associated with wars on American soil.
Under the cover of thick trees and brush, archaeologists and students harvest and catalog the remains of a long-forgotten winter. Bent nails and broken buttons are prized clues that tie this small, wooded area to New York's place in American history. Not long ago, it was lost, nearly forever. In the farthest reaches of northern New York, the history of the War of 1812 is still being revealed. It took the commitment of a few dedicated individuals to keep the hope of that discovery alive. Most Americans know very little about a war fought within our borders that defined our independence and path to prominence. It is a stark contrast to the wars of the 20th century that forged our nation on foreign soil. This site of granite and water, erected in 2006, pays tribute to American soldiers who fought for freedom thousands of miles away. Servicemen and women, some in wheelchairs, others with sturdy canes, arrived via the Honor Flight program, which flies World War II veterans to Washington to visit the memorial. It is their first chance to see the grand showcase, an architectural reflection of their sacrifices. Visitors stop in reverence to the soldiers, a powerful moment digitally captured and stored. And a bittersweet reminder for families who had hoped to share this moment with their heroes. Millions of Americans make pilgrimage to this site and the other memorials surrounding it each year. Eyes dart across bronze and stone, hands trace the names of the fallen. The war monuments of the last century hold personal meaning for many, as the lines drawn between generations are easier to trace. The history we share as Americans is no less important, even if there is a palatable disconnect between our digital world and the grassy lakeside pastures where cannons rang out and muskets ended lives. 2 centuries ago, these lands were the stage for a war that had a tremendous impact on what our country would become. In New York State, these historic battlefields weave through towns and villages. Some are documented, interpreted, even celebrated. Others remain invisible. They are lost to time and neglect through development and progress.
I think the modern consciousness of Americans is that war happens somewhere else. It happens in Iraq, happens in Afghanistan, Korea, the Pacific theater, the European theater. But people tend to forget that there were battles that were fought on American soil, and people lost their lives on American soil trying to defend it from potential invaders. And so it'd be nice if we recognized those sacrifices and thought about those spaces more in terms of sacred spaces special places than just an empty field.
200 years ago, our nation, still in its infancy, raised arms against what it considered to be a precarious threat to its newly minted independence. The British Empire, still engaged in the ongoing Napoleonic Wars, tested that independence through trade embargoes and the seizing of U.S. soldiers, forcing them to serve in the Royal Navy. Compounding that threat was the British military support of Native American Indians in an effort to stop the westward expansion of the United States. And yet the War of 1812 is widely considered America's forgotten war. No matter how much you may or may not remember from history class, the War of 1812 left an indelible mark on this country, forging its path for growth and prosperity as a brand new nation.
Well, the United States, as a result of the Revolution, had embarked on a very radical political experiment known as a republic. Now, today we take for granted the success of a republic. We've come to call it a democracy. They were creating this by scratch. And if they studied their history, as they certainly did, all of the ancient and medieval republics of Europe had failed. So the odds were against them.
We declared war on the mightiest nation in the world. They had hundreds of thousands of troops. They had 1,000 ship of the line. We had maybe 20 or 30 gunboats. That's it. It was not a very smart thing to do for the United States at the time.
You can argue that the American military establishment actually was born in the War of 1812. In addition, we got a lot of sayings and symbols, the USS Constitution, the Fort McHenry flag, the Kentucky rifle, Uncle Sam. We have met the enemy and they are ours, don't give up the ship, and the like, that I really think helped shape American identity. So if we won our independence from Great Britain in the American Revolution, we forged our identity, at least in some sense, as a result of the War of 1812.
That new national identity was vigorously defended, from the Gulf of Mexico to the shores of the Great Lakes. 2 centuries later, the lands where those important battles were staged are disappearing. Development, pollution, and even indifference are wiping out significant historical sites, and with them the potential benefit for future generations. The concern prompted Congress to call for a study of early American battlefield sites in order to determine exactly what was left. The exhaustive study, completed in 2007, painted a bleak picture. According to the report, 47% of the War of 1812 battlefields are in good or fair condition. 53% are in poor condition or are forever gone. It's not hard to understand how so many of these waterfront parcels and former farms have become lost through time. When the Americans declared war on Britain in June of 1812, the population of the U.S. was sparse. Only 7 million lived in what was still a new country.
A lot of the Revolutionary War and War of 1812 battles occurred 80, 50 some odd years before the Civil War occurred. So you have more of them being taken over by other development, so the sites become lost. And they were more concentrated, too, towards the population centers, whereas the Civil War, you imagine the country was much, much larger, and therefore a lot of the rural areas where a lot of the battles took place were still in rural areas when preservation started becoming more acceptable.
This is Northern New York's legacy. Over the course of a year, we traveled to 4 upstate communities, all with deep roots in the War of 1812, and yet each in dramatically different stages of preservation. In each, we found hope that what remains will not be lost without a fight. Committed historians and archaeologists and passionate citizens are making the case to save the battlefields and the rich heritage that is just below the surface, a heritage often taken for granted.
History just didn't occur in the history books. It took place with actual people at actual places during actual times, and sometimes those people are not much different than ourselves. But they did something significant, and they did it here.
For many, the passage of time does not diminish the power of these hallowed lands. In fact, right here in Sackett's Harbor, on the shores of Lake Ontario, thousands have gathered over the summer to take part in multiple celebrations commemorating the bicentennial of the War of 1812.
Americans were vastly outnumbered when it came to fighting against the well-armed British Navy. To measure up, the U.S. would need ships, and fast. So what was once just a sleepy fishing village on the eastern shore of Lake Ontario quickly became the epicenter of the U.S. military and naval operations during the war. The population of Sackett's Harbor exploded. Thousands of shipbuilders, soldiers, and Marines converged on the village. Sackett's and shipbuilding would become synonymous as the massive warships needed to protect American interests were constructed in this port. Today, reenactors, scholars, and history devotees make pilgrimage to where American and Royal forces fought for control of the Great Lakes and passage into northern territories. Visitors like Lorna Hainsworth, who has spent the past year traveling around the east coast of the United States and Canada to experience firsthand the narrative of this important part of American history.
You know, this is my time to commemorate something extraordinary. It's 200 years, it's very special.
That passion for history puts Lorna first in line for Sackett's Harbor's newest exhibit, Digging the Past. Here, visitors explore some of the artifacts unearthed during the most recent survey by battlefield archaeologists. Matt Kirk was part of that important dig.
And our thought was that if we can find human residue on those artifacts, it could tie it directly to the battle. Because even though that place was occupied afterwards by encampments, if there was human blood on those, we know that that was associated directly with the battle and not some other event that happened later down the road. Most importantly, it helps us to define the boundaries of the battlefield. And that will help in the long term of trying to protect the site so that we know exactly where it was.
But here at Sackett's Harbor, I think benefit that we have is the relative lack of encroachment on the original battlefield going back now 200 years that has been saved and preserved and kept from the kind of commercial development that over time has impinged on other historic sites. So when we tell the story here at Sackett's Harbor, you can look out to Lake Ontario toward Horse Island and tell the story of the British forces coming to Sackett's Harbor and show it in a way that you're not looking over a housing development or a strip mall or some of the things that just happen to have developed over time in other locations.
Leading the interpretive mission is Connie Barone, site manager for the Sackett's Harbor battlefield.
I think the uniqueness of the history of Sackett's, the harbor, the importance of that for shipbuilding, the war years, is very, very important. That is what defines this community. It is scenic, but it is historic. And when you put those two elements together, you have a perfect combination for cultural heritage tourism.
Sackett's Harbor may seem an ideal example of preservation, but it has not always been the case. Only in this generation has the community seen an historic rebirth.
Well, like many small communities, Sackett's Harbor was in desperate state 25 years ago. The downtown was in shambles. We had very few businesses left. In fact, the grocery stores were gone. And the village fathers and volunteers decided this just couldn't happen. We had a business here called Augsbury Oil years ago that went defunct, and they owned 110 acres, of which a fair amount of it was actually the original battlefield. They went under, and the state took it over. It was a brownfield site, and then it went to auction, and it was purchased by a developer from Colorado. They came in gangbusters. They were going to clean it up. They were going to build marinas and hotels and who knows what else. All of it on the water, which is, of course, where our battlefield was. Fortunately, that didn't come to pass. The village, when they started bowing out of their big plans, were able to buy the property and form LDC, a local development corporation. And we set it up again with volunteers, and our goal was to turn over to the state at least as much as possible of that 110 acres that could be determined to be the original battlefield.
While I was mayor in 2005, we were able to, having gotten a clean bill of health on 40 acres, to begin serious dialogue on what will become of this acreage. And I think it's fair to say that there were probably contending perspectives. Some people saw open space along a waterway or along the shoreline as just ideal for housing. Other people, I think, said, look, let's not diminish the value of open space. And then we had another factor to bring to bear. Let's not diminish the power for the community's future that saving this battlefield site could have.
Well, I think in years past, probably there wasn't as great an awareness of preservation. And certainly that's why a lot of battlefields, battlegrounds everywhere in the world get developed. And you begin to bring in different elements onto those battlegrounds that are not part of preservation. But I think in more recent years, people are much more aware.
And it's always a creative balance that you have to have. And you got to try to make everybody happy. But both have led to, our development over the years.
There's a phenomenal pride that has grown over the years here in the village because we're a community that came a long way from where we were in the aftermath of the closing of Madison Barracks in the mid-40s and in a gradual kind of decline.
We take our history very seriously here, and you have to make a compromise. Could we afford maybe a little better roads, maybe some more street lights, maybe some more sidewalks? Absolutely. But it was no choice in a lot of ours mind. We need to preserve that history.
That history plays out in full color each year as reenactors transform the grounds to a snapshot of war in the early 1800s. At the far end of the battlefield, in the shadow of the town's only commercial dairy farm, Canadian and American soldiers in full period dress march to a new granite marker. Nearly 50 members of the New Brunswick 104th Regiment, killed at the Second Battle of Sackett's Harbor, remain here. The exact location of the unmarked graves is still unknown. The blood that spilled here now bonds the two nations together.
Today, we gather to dedicate a monument to the Crown Forces who were killed at the battle and buried by the Americans.
This is incredibly historic. And the part that really appeals to me was that this was an initiative by the community here in Sackett's Harbor to recognize the Crown Forces. And that's something else that when they felt it was significant enough to recognize the British and Canadian forces that came here and fought, it's incredible that they've recognized their sacrifice in this way. It's a really generous, incredibly community-minded thing.
Private Louis Desjardins, Private Robert Gibson.
As soldiers pay tribute to the fallen, a cluster of dairy cows go about their daily business, unaware of the ceremony happening just across the corn. This is just another day at Bolton Beach Farms. Merle Bolton's family has worked this land since just after the War of 1812. Other than a few additions needed for a modern farm, the land still looks and feels the way it would have 200 years ago. These cornfields still hold the memories of the war. It is the same land upon which men marched, fought, and died. And although it is privately owned, it is a recognized part of the Sackett's Harbor battlefield. And it remains the town's only working farm.
The Bolton farm is on the left-hand side of the road. This was the Browns farm, and before that was Gilmore. My dad purchased the Brown farm probably 30 years ago, and now we own everything from the Willow Tree down towards the lake.
Well, the actual battles were fought out here, and actually off to the right of us is where they found a large amount of musket balls, so that we know that the battle was this close to where we are right now.
My great-grandfather, of course, farmed all the Augsbury property, which borders the state battlefield now. He farmed that back with horses and plows, and everything was slow, and you'd actually see artifacts rolling up because it was such a slower pace versus a big tractor, diesel tractor, and it was a slower pace. And he actually would see artifacts coming up, musket balls, buttons, whatnot.
Merle admits he takes the history for granted, the way people can take living on the water for granted. His focus from dusk till dawn is to make sure the 300 head of cattle are happy and healthy. But the connection of owning part of the battlefield still ignites his imagination.
We spent countless hours in the fields working behind the steering wheel, and it's like anything, it gets very boring and repetitious, and then you just sit back for a second and just think of what happened on the grounds, and it's kind of it's a special feeling that if you only knew what actually happened where you're standing at that moment, it's quite unique.
Hoping our son may take over the farm someday and continue to keep it an open space like it is.
Well, you know, ideally, yes, it would be great to save every blade of grass that was part of the battlegrounds. And in different ways we can save that. For example, a large part of the active battleground is a working farm. And so that land has been taken care of for 160 years by the family that is preserving the battleground.
Full-time accountant and part-time reenactor Sandy Dobson is grateful for the care taken in preserving a rare piece of shared history.
Despite the fact I'm wearing American, I'm Canadian. And we trace our roots back to the 1750s. So we're longtime Canadians. The War of 1812 was a lot more important up there. It shaped how we became Canada and how Canada came about. It also, I mean, we're standing on battlefield ground right now. And a lot of times we can't stand on the battlefield ground because, you know, we'll do it over in a field near the battlefield because the battlefield's now McDonald's, Harvey's, Walmart, something like that.
This is one of the top 5 recognized nationally War of 1812 battlefield sites in the nation. It's recognized not just here, but it's recognized nationally. So it gives a community then a recognition that, wow, we got something pretty special.
We all are so proud of it, so proud to be living here and proud to honor the commitment that was made by those that fought there, that I only see that continuing.
When people started to think about preserving battlefields, it was like in the 1880s. Most of the battles were fought in rural areas, and say Civil War battles fought in the 1860s, and maybe even more of 1812 battles. Those areas in the 1880s were still pretty much rural. People thought they would be rural forever. So the first effort to memorialize these battlefields, usually, with some exceptions, usually came in the form of the War Department, predecessor of the modern-day Department of the Army, being appropriated some money to buy an acre of land to put an appropriate marker and on which the local government or whoever could erect a monument. And that was fine until the 1960s. And then, like you say, Sackett's Harbor, beautiful location, Lake Champlain here, beautiful waterfront locations. Who wouldn't want to live there? Who wouldn't want to build something there? And it not being protected, it sometimes fell victim to those type of things.
For many small towns and cities, battlefield protection often comes down to economics. Good intentions are often not enough. Someone who knows that better than anyone is Jim Lighthizer, president of the Civil War Trust.
There's something about a sense of place, particularly when it comes to significant history anywhere in the world. And the ability to go to that place has a special resonance with human beings. It's just the nature of who we are. And when you go to those places, assuming they're preserved and assuming they're properly interpreted, they're really outdoor classrooms. They not only invoke memory, but they teach.
Much like War of 1812 battlefields, saving historic sites of the Civil War is not assured.
As we speak, as far as the American Civil War goes, they're paving over stuff right now.
The battle lines of the Civil War crossed over 19 states and lasted over 4 years. Some of the bloodiest conflicts happened here in this small southern Pennsylvania town, a town that today hosts 1.7 million visitors and generates over $100 million in revenue each year. This is Gettysburg.
Without a doubt, it's probably one of the most famous battles and battlefields in America today. And Gettysburg is always right there at the top of the list of a place to visit. It became somewhat of a tourist attraction within the first 2 or 3 weeks of the battle. A lot of people came here to visit the battlefield, either looking for loved ones or just to satisfy curiosity of what actually happened here. And the people in town who were destitute at that time, their homes are filled with wounded. The battlefield is still covered with dead horses and in some cases unburied bodies. They're willing to become automatic guides for some of these people who are coming around the battlefield, at least to show them the highlights of where a Union general was killed or a general's headquarters or something like that. They knew very little about it. But that was the beginning, in a rough way, of the tourist business that became Gettysburg.
However, by the 100th anniversary of the Civil War, that business had become more of a focus than the actual historic site.
In the 1960s, Gettysburg was a real tourist town, and in some ways was quite a bit of a tourist trap for many people. Even though the National Park Service managed the battlefield itself, the battlefield park, there were so many other things around it and on it and in it that confused people. They were private holdings, private industries, private museums. You could come here and drop a lot of money very quickly and not even get out onto the battlefield.
As Gettysburg celebrates the 150th anniversary of the Civil War's turning point battle, tourism is still the principal industry of the township. Visitors enjoy t-shirt and gift shops and nighttime ghost tours. But today, Gettysburg's tourism mission is more focused on education. According to Lighthizer, finding that balance is not easy, but it can be transformative for communities. Those who seek it out commit to saving history that can be showcased in their own backyard.
Historic tourism is the highest end spenders that there are in American tourism business. And so tourism or history, good preservation, good interpretation means good tourism, which means it's good for the local economy.
Donovan Ripkema is principal of Place Economics in Washington, D.C. His work has focused on the economic impact of historic preservation, including the rehabilitation of historic structures.
Well, too often there's this perception that you have either historic preservation or you have economic development, and that's absolutely false choice. That's sheer utter nonsense. That historic resources really are the means to economic development. They are the vehicle through which, by capitalizing on its historic resources, communities can have economic development.
Well, I think people are coming to realize in the last 30 years that preservation makes good economic sense, setting aside the importance of knowing and learning about our history, which is significant.
When you look around the country at cities that have declined and then come back, Philadelphia, Washington, Boston, New York City, all of which experienced decided population declines, where people came back to first was not the city in general, it was to the historic neighborhoods in the city. And so if we say we're always going to be smaller and nothing we can do about it and goodbye population, then what the hell does the difference does it make? But if you say we want to position ourselves so in a cycle, in a decade or 20 years, that we have a place that will attract people to coming back to, that's going to be in historic neighborhoods. It just is.
In Ogdensburg, cars speed by on Route 68, the main route through town, with little notice of a community garden next to a tall stone monument. For those more curious, a short stroll down a dirt road brings you to Lighthouse Point, where residents can practically shout hello to their Canadian neighbors on the opposite banks of the St. Lawrence River. It's where the site of Fort de la Presentation used to stand, and where preservationists hope it will rise again. Faithful stewards have been working for years to clean up the battlefield that was heavily polluted by industry during the 20th century, and where they hope they will soon start building a new future that celebrates the city's important past. For Barbara O'Keefe, it's history worth fighting for.
In '87, I joined the Historical Commission. I wanted something to do, and I like history. I'm not a historian. And I met Persis Boyesen, who was then the city historian, and listened to her, and it was like, whoa, you can't be kidding me. All this happened here. And yes, it did.
Ogdensburg is indeed an old city with a rich history. In 1748, a priest, Francois Piquet, founded a small settlement right here at the confluence of the St. Lawrence and Asquagachi rivers. Known as the Apostle to the Iroquois, Piquet's mission was to convert the Indian people to Christianity, and in doing so, make them loyal soldiers for the French crown. Soon after his arrival, Fort La Presentation became an important garrison for the French as a military base and trading post on the Great Lakes. An American flag would not rise here until 1796, and it almost did not remain. With only about 1,200 people in the little village, Ogdensburg prospered, trading with its British neighbors across the river. But once the War of 1812 was declared, tensions grew. After a series of predatory strikes from both sides, British troops marched across the frozen St. Lawrence from Prescott, Ontario, to capture Ogdensburg on February 22, 1813.
and the river actually froze over in those years, and you
Yeah,
were able to cross it.
So it was much colder than winters are now, and so the St. Lawrence River was frozen hard, and the British and Canadian forces were in the practice of practicing military maneuvers on the ice.
So the U.S. forces on this side could see them there.
Could see them there.
On a daily basis, and then suddenly the attack came.
And suddenly they're in this maneuver, and then they break off the maneuver and they come charging across the ice, which the people here, the defenders, didn't expect. So they were taken by surprise.
With no plans to rebuild the fort, the abandoned base was dismantled, with its wood, metal, and stone harvested to help build the growing industrial community of Ogdensburg.
We were, in our heyday, a port community, a hub of economic activity for railroad and commerce that was coming into the country and traversing into the Great Lakes. We were one of the main stops back in the day because the seaway was not developed at that time.
We were the last port on the lakes. So once you got to Ogdensburg, you had to stop, the ships had to stop and unload because the rapids, the St. Lawrence Rapids, were just downriver from here. So manufacturing sprung up here.
First a shipyard, then a railroad yard, and finally a petroleum tank farm. The cost of industry in the 20th century was steep, and after many years of growth and development on the shores of the St. Lawrence, Ogdensburg had to face the ugly truth that its greatest resource may now be its greatest obstacle to new development.
Probably 20 years ago, I was approached by one of our spill engineers from our Watertown office, and he indicated that there was a site that contained petroleum products that was probably going to need to be cleaned up, and that he also heard that there was the possible site of a fortification that was in use from the French and Indian War through the War of 1812 on the site.
In 1980, New York passed the State Historic Preservation Act as a complement to the National Historic Preservation Act. It was Charles Vandry's job to make sure that what was left in Ogdensburg was not left behind.
The law is designed so that projects that are implemented minimize their impacts to historic properties, minimize or avoid, and then when they can't avoid, we try to come up with mitigation measures. With archaeological sites, usually the mitigation, if a site can't be avoided, the impact mitigation means recovering the archaeological information from the site before it's destroyed. In the end, we did have the New York State Museum do a small amount of work out there in areas where it appeared that the contamination and the archaeological materials were commingled.
The decision by the Fort Association was to move forward even with the possibility of not being able to save this battlefield. The plan was simple: create a destination that will draw people to Ogdensburg through interpretive history and education. Rebuilding a replica of the original fort is the ultimate goal, but reclaiming the land where history happened was job one, and it was not going to be easy.
Well, we got 17 acres in 1999. We were going to purchase it for $100,000, but eventually the Paul Carr Foundation donated the land to us. The only problem is with the industrial past history of this property, we thought we better investigate.
I had received several requests to help out with the project, and for the most part I'd ignored them for a few months because it was a large investment on our part, and just knowing and hearing that there was a former gas terminal here, I knew the effort that it would take. So eventually the group talked me into meeting with them, so I trekked to Ogdensburg on a Saturday morning and had breakfast in the diner, and I got bit by the bug.
There was a tank farm on the ExxonMobil property, and they would dock over near Tom Duffy's property, and there was a pipeline that ran between them with an elbow in it. The elbow leaked.
On a relative scale, it was severe, based on other bulk storage facilities that I'm familiar with. But again, the contaminant was petroleum, which has components that in and of itself are hazardous or toxic to humans and the environment.
In this case, what we did was a combination of avoiding impact
You know, the engineers were very careful about the way they designed their cleanup protocol in order to basically attack the parts of the site that really, the parts of the contaminants that really needed to be cleaned up, while not overdoing it and therefore unnecessarily hitting archaeological aspects of the site.
In 2006, the cleanup was almost completed. There was 8,000 tons of contaminated soil taken out of here.
When you understand the history and you understand the story and you understand and hear how they reclaimed that site and how they brought it back to the use it's at, I mean, it's a remarkable story, and I think it shows proof of a group of dedicated individuals that didn't accept no for an answer. You know, they were against a lot of odds. I mean, people were saying, hey, you're not going to be able to do that. You're up against large corporations. You're up against other entities that are going to put stumbling blocks in your way. And they fought that, they stood fast, and they brought it back to productive use, and I think I'm extremely proud of what they've done.
After years of litigation, planning, and remediation, the site was ready for the next step.
As soon as, when split rail fencing went up, it was like coming down the hill, I finally got the vision of, yes, there will be a fort here.
The vision was clear, but the U.S. economy was not. And suddenly, plans that had been building momentum for over 2 decades came to a halt.
The end of 2006, we thought we had an agreement between ExxonMobil, the property owners, the New York State Spill Fund, Controller's Office, that would have given the fort the additional 2 pieces, the original site of the fort, ExxonMobil property, and funds to have something in place for the commemoration of the last battle, the French and Indian War, in 2010. Unfortunately, it fell apart, but we're still working on it.
I think the biggest challenge, obviously, is money. It takes money to rebuild the fort, and if you look at what the Fort La Presentation Company's done, they have reclaimed that site, which was a major petroleum spill site. And they worked with the DEC, with our state elected officials, federal elected officials, and got the site cleaned up. ExxonMobil cleaned it up. And so I think that's a huge step in allowing the site to be reused. Now the next step is to find funding to rebuild the fort. You can always look at it and say, we like that property and tax roll, it's prime waterfront, but I look at it the other way and I say that's going to be a cornerstone to bring new people into the community.
Heritage tourism is big industry. The state is changing. Early 2000s, when I talked to economic development agencies in the state of New York, it's like, we can't help you. You're not industry. You're not economic development. But now, path through history. We have more history in New York State than Virginia or Pennsylvania. We just haven't used it. It's big business.
In late 2013, the Fort Association received a boost, a $350,000 grant from the state flagged to help the town develop its waterfront walking trail and the interpretive center. With conceptual plans already in place, the money will help build a half-mile trail with signs illustrating the site's history, from the French and Indian War through its War of 1812 battles.
Well, the Fort La Presentation Interpretive Center and also the fort is a key integral part of the economy here, because not only does it showcase the history, it also attracts visitors, it adds to the fabric of the community, and it's going to be a truly wonderful facility when it's built.
I really am not a history buff. I certainly know a lot about this site and a lot about the past. I walk across this site, and I think it just takes you as you walk across the site, not just a history, but the beauty of the 2 rivers, the kind of confluence of the 2 rivers, with the International Bridge in the background. And I don't think there's probably a more beautiful site in northern New York.
I think what makes a site like Ogdensburg special is the fact that it's a small site, in the sense that it didn't necessarily have, you know, armies with thousands of men encamped on it, and therefore it has the potential to, I think, provide better information about small portions of the war, the stuff that didn't get written down, because not everything gets written down, but a lot of it gets left in the ground for us to learn later.
This impressive fortress behind me is the legendary Fort Ontario here in Oswego, New York. The walls you see today are actually the final rebuild of the fort after it was destroyed and reconstructed several times over by British, French, and American troops. Because of its ideal location on Lake Ontario, Oswego was vital, not only in the War of 1812, but also in the American Revolution, French and Indian War, and even in World War II. In fact, Oswego was America's first freshwater shipping port. It was a gateway to Lake Ontario and had tremendous military advantages, including shipbuilding and supply transport. Although named to the National Registry for Historic Sites more than 40 years ago, Fort Ontario still faces threats, not from cannon fire or foreign enemy, but of state defunding and industrial growth. As somebody who studies this, and this is sort of your area of specialty, how does it feel to work your days here on this very special location?
Just every day here, it's walking the footsteps of history.
Paul Lear is the site manager for Fort Ontario State Historic Site. Paul has seen a lot of changes around the fort and the city in the nearly 3 decades he's served as educator here. But that is nothing compared to what these ramparts have witnessed over the last 3 centuries.
Oswego, because of water, has always had a bigger history than a city or community of its size normally would.
In May of 1814, the British fleet set sail for Oswego over the Great Lakes. Their objective was to seize American supplies before they could be sent north on Lake Ontario to Sackett's Harbor, where the U.S. Navy was building critically needed warships. However, a late spring storm held the Royal Navy offshore long enough for the Americans to shepherd much of the naval supplies out of their reach. Eventually, almost 1,000 British troops made it ashore, greatly outnumbering the Americans, and forcing a U.S. retreat. The British left the port city days later after the Battle of Oswego, but not before destroying Fort Ontario and its bastions.
The soldiers from the 1814 battle, the British soldiers, their remains have never been found. They're probably out towards the east of the fort, in one of the neighborhoods.
Paul estimates about 250,000 people utilize the fort every year. Visitors include those taking part in military ceremonies, history buffs taking a tour, battlefield reenactors, or just the locals stopping by to take in the Oswego sunset from up on the ramparts. The sun almost set permanently over the fort a few short years ago. As part of a plan to close an $8.2 billion budget deficit, the state proposed closing 41 parks and 14 historic sites, including Fort Ontario. The resilient site that had been destroyed and rebuilt time and again faced oblivion. Ultimately, the closings did not happen, and the fort continues to be open seasonally. However, the actual battlefield stretches out much farther than these stone walls.
We have extensive grounds use. It's the biggest recreational area in the city of Oswego. We have ball fields, we have dog walkers, we have kite flyers.
And they also have an active shipping industry, the economic driver that shaped this port city and many communities it reached through the canal system. Oswego still welcomes cargo and shipments from all parts of the world into the Port Authority of Oswego. This creates important jobs and growth for the region. But for the fort, it can be a fragile relationship, with preservationists always mindful of future development at history's door.
Fortunately, here we have most of the 18th century battlefield preserved and the War of 1812 battlefield. There is a small section to the east side of our property that is controlled by the Port Authority.
Of the approximately 75 acres of the Fort Ontario National Registry District, the Port Authority retains 10 acres. In the 20th century, early industrialization along the east side of the battlefield has left that area classified as a contaminated brownfield. It also marks the spot where British forces landed in 1814 and marched up the hill to begin the Battle of Oswego.
Well, as a manager and a community leader, you have to be concerned about everything. So yes, I do worry, and I do what I can, and hopefully processes are followed.
In the meantime, Paul leads the charge of preserving and sharing the deep history of his shoreline, and with each passing day, it grows richer.
When you say Oswego, they light up because they know its historical significance. The French-Indian War, the Revolution, and onwards. So it's an interesting reaction, but forts are kind of cool. People like them. They're great places to visit. History goes on here.
Plattsburgh is north, really north, about as far north as you can get in New York State before you land in Vermont. But it's Plattsburgh's placement along the banks of Lake Champlain that made it another critical site during the War of 1812. One of the largest engagements, the Battle of Plattsburgh on September 11, 1814, was a critical turning point in the war. America's victory here ended the British campaign to control the Great Lakes and ultimately led to the signing of the Treaty of Ghent just 3 short months later. And the birth of the U.S. Navy is often attributed to the ships that sailed on this very lake during that war, many of which still remain entombed as shipwrecks. But it is inland where a recently solved mystery of a lost site has historians and students hopeful for renewed preservation efforts, the discovery of Pike's Cantonment.
We're looking for a site that has been subject to years and years and years of controversy as far as its location. It was noted to be in 6 different locations, which is impossible, and it couldn't have moved. And there were 10 different theories on where it was, but it's all been here all the time.
Within the marked off 12 by 12 area, sifted dirt and sand hides the artifacts of a brutal North Country winter. Nails and buttons, carefully harvested from the site, become the prized physical evidence that this is the exact location of Pike's Cantonment.
We are standing in what is the only, as far as we know, the only archaeological record of an existing 1812 campsite from the period. There is none other in the country that we're aware of. There are plenty of examples from the Revolutionary War. There are plenty of models from the Civil War. But prior to this, there was no record of any extant 1812 structure for a temporary campsite, and this is a time capsule.
For Hercolo, it is also a bittersweet reminder of a man who came so close to solving one of the battle's greatest mysteries.
My mentor was a fellow named Alan Everest, and he was a professor emeritus at Plattsburgh State University, and for 30-some years he did the research and tried to narrow down the place where this site is, and its importance is that in the War of 1814, September the 11th, 1814, the majority of the British force crossed the river right the other side of where we're located here and crossed at Pike's Old Cantonment. So if you know where Pike's Cantonment is, you know where the British were on September the 11th, 1814, and the entire ground war now is suddenly put into its proper perspective. Unfortunately, he died in 1997, and he was never able to finish that work. Picking up on that from several conversations that I had prior to his passing, I picked up the ball and rolled with that. And we had many other historians that contributed to the story and how we got here.
The campsite was named after Colonel Zebulon Montgomery Pike, the noted explorer for whom Pike's Peak in Colorado is also named. In 1812, this wooded area was temporary home to more than 2,000 battle-worn soldiers after a failed American assault on Montreal.
His job was to keep them alive for the winter and protect Plattsburgh. Well, there were no forts, there were no cabins, there was nothing here. They had to start building their own cabins in late November, early December, and it was really cold.
The following year, Colonel Murray of the British forces came and attacked Plattsburgh, burned the village, burned much of the village, I should say, the military stores primarily. And then they had also heard from a spy that there was an encampment up here, and they came up the river and destroyed the encampment, burned it to the ground. And that was essentially the end of Pike's Cantonment.
As the ashes cooled, so did the war. Resulting successes of the young U.S. Navy on Lake Champlain and in the Gulf region secured a peace treaty. And while some in the North still harbored suspicion of those just across the border, life went on. The story and location of Pike's Cantonment faded into relative obscurity. Dr. Tim Abel has led the archaeological dig here for the past 3 years. What what has surprised him most about the discovery is the overall integrity of the site.
Most of the time when we excavate a site, we're finding the very bottom layer of an occupation, because most of the upper layers have been disturbed and farmed away. But here we don't have that problem. We brush away the leaves and it's all there. It's right there. And you no more than start picking away and you find evidence right on the surface. And to me, that's always amazing, is to have a site where you have evidence laying right on the surface. You don't have to go anywhere as far as depth to really start to find evidence. There's no waiting involved. We were finding nails and things within hours of beginning the work here.
What had helped the site stay unharmed is exactly what almost destroyed it. While volunteers dig for more clues, Flight 265 out of Boston skims the treetops, a reminder of how close development came to wiping out this piece of history.
This was part of the former Air Force installation. Military installation has been around here since the birth of the nation. When the Air Force closed the base, the BRAC Commission, it was a shock. It was sort of like, Elvis is dead. No, he's on an island somewhere, nobody believed. The beauty is the Air Force, the development of the highway we can hear off in the background stopped. And that became a barrier. Because the military had very, very strict security. I mean, we had FB-111s here with nuclear bombs. The security prevented anybody from coming into this area, and Mother Nature took over. So this corner of the encampment, this corner of history, has been preserved. 100% of the original site, no, but a significant portion. I think the work going on will discover exactly how much has been saved, but totally untouched since the British came through and burned it.
Well, as a site that is fairly accessible, I mean, there's always a chance that people will come in without any training and will remove data from the site. I mean, many people consider it harmless collecting, but it is actually removing data from the site that might otherwise tell us a story. So that's probably one of the biggest dangers. I think the dangers from development, have pretty much been handled by the ownership of the county and its proximity to the airfield. But that doesn't mean that it's completely, totally safe.
The archaeological study is also a chance for future scientists to get hands-on experience at a rare historic site. It's a tedious process, but so far no complaints.
I found the first nail. I was pretty excited, so I have one up for that.
Really, the exciting stuff is just finding the bricks that are intact and finding the nails that are bent in weird ways, and actually being able to touch the stuff that they touched during the time period, because we're just unearthing things that haven't been seen for almost 200 years. So, and we get to do this every single day.
I could actually see the feature of the cabin pretty clearly from the surface. I mean, there was brick everywhere, and you could see that there was something under the ground.
Well, I think as you've noticed today, we just see one little area, but as the next few years will indicate, this is going to expand a long way toward the road, for example. And when they start really doing the dig in earnest, you're going to find some discoveries that will warrant attention, and also, I think, support from the state and federal folks, because it's so important for our heritage and our history. So I think it would be the right thing to do.
This will go on for a number of years. It's literally just begun.
What excites me, first of all, is that Alan Everest was right all along. He had the story nailed down historically through the historic record. This is the record of the War of 1812, and it's alive today by what's happening here.
I judge wars on the basis of their consequences. And we tend to dismiss this war because we don't look at the consequences, we look at the war itself, which seems sort of a small potatoes affair. But it looks to me like it deserves a much higher profile in our history because of those profound and lasting consequences.
I just really think that it's important that battlefields and historic places be preserved, because without them, we don't have any character, we don't have any depth. We are just a bunch of shallow people with a lot of condos and shopping malls.
I think it really all goes back to people, because people are the ones who have to implement.
Preservation And battlefield rehabilitation of any field or structure for that matter is a continual process. It doesn't end once you have it and once you put a marker on it, once you've established it. It goes on forever.
If you've got a unique asset in your community, well, you're crazy not to use it. If it's a quality product, which is to say that you can go there and have a sense of what the folks that did the history saw and did, you've got an asset, and they'll come. No question about it. The tourists will come, and they come with money in their pockets.
In our travels through northern New York and beyond, one recurring truth became central to each story. To protect our history, we must all engage in our history. It's not a burden that should be placed on the shoulders of a committed few to protect these important sites, but a gift that citizens of all communities should work to protect for ourselves and future generations. I'm Timothy Davis Reed. Thanks for joining us.
Losing Ground was made possible through the support of our members.
And by the National Park Service's American Battlefield Protection Program, promoting the preservation of significant historic battlefields associated with wars on American soil.
For a DVD copy of this program, please visit WCNY.org.